a hacker figured out a way to take all this data and track, people's yachts, people's planes. Obviously, one of those people was Elon. Elon had a security issue. This is all public information. So the larger issue at stake here is the fact that the law allows for people to do this persistent tracking of planes, which then becomes persistent tracking of a person. And what really is at stake here is how we define the term doxing. For people who don't know the term doxing, it means giving a person's location. That could be your home. That could also be you're at a location for some period of time. You're at a hotel, for a basketball game. And it's pretty clear. You can take a picture of a celebrity and say, there's a celebrity here. Oh, Lady Gaga's at the farmer's market. What I object to here, we all understand doxing is dangerous and it, in fact, is against the law to just give people's addresses and stuff like that. The issue here is a new type of doxing, which I'll call, persistent, coordinated doxing, where dozens of times a month you're giving a person's location. It may not be against the First Amendment, Sachs, I think you would agree, but we have to ask ourselves, do we want to live in a world where whether a person's on an electric bicycle or an airplane or any device in between, somebody should be releasing dozens of times a month a specific dedicated feed of their location? It is terrorizing as a parent when this happens. I've had doxing, people on the call here have had various security concerns. We don't want to live in a world with de facto doxing. What these sites were doing was de facto doxing.
I think it was a bad decision. And I think that it represented, on the least generous statement would be that it represents deep hypocrisy, in that not just a few weeks ago did he say he would never delete that account, but he also said he was buying Twitter to enable freedom of speech and freedom of expression, and that he wouldn't come in and do the same sort of content moderation that was done by the old regime. And then he came in and did exactly what the old regime did, which is that he took the rules and he took the, quote, moderation policies, and he found a way to use them to make some editorialized decisions that he thought was appropriate. Now, the more generous thing is what you guys are saying, which I don't think is necessarily wrong, which is that he's trying to protect people where there's some loophole or some law that doesn't seem right morally, but it is the law, and it is what it is. In those cases, I think you run into the exact same issue that the old guard at Twitter had, that the moderators and the executives at YouTube have dealt with, and that the executives at Google have dealt with, and that we sit here and we criticize until you're on that side of the table. And you're forced to make these moderation decisions, you're forced to make these policy decisions, and you're forced to implement these policy decisions because of some moral framework that you now think is appropriate. And guess what? Some people will say that's not freedom of expression. That's not freedom of speech. You're taking that away from some people. You're taking this particular case away from a 15 or 16-year-old kid who's built a Twitter feed. And so I think what it shows is just how hard it is to moderate these sites, these platforms, and that there is no simple, easy, idealistic ideologue of, hey, all these things are open, all these things can be used by anyone all the time. Because as soon as one of these edge cases start to happen, you want to come in and do something about it.
Chamath, what do you think? What should happen going forward?
So I have had these issues happen to me multiple times. I'm not nearly as important as Elon is, but it feels the same when you're in the middle of it. It feels pretty terrorizing. That being said, I think the real decision for somebody like me is that if it's too much, is frankly just to get rid of it and to find a different mode of transportation that's a little bit more anonymous. And
you're pragmatic about it.
And the reason I say that is that I just think that you would have to go and get the government to basically change the law, which they're not going to do. And so then as a result, your reaction will seem somewhat contrived and deeply personal. And in that, I think you lose credibility. Let me just summarize this and be the first one to just state this. I think that if there's any person in the world that can figure out Twitter, it's probably Elon. But man, has he taken on just a gargantuan battle. And increasingly, I am not a fan of this battle, and I'll tell you why. This is a man who has essentially proven that he can bend the laws of physics on behalf of humanity. He's done it twice. Once in electric cars, and once in rocketry. The problem is that the realm of decision-making at Twitter has nothing to do with the laws of physics and is governed by emotions and psychology, in which there is no canonically right answer. And so he's quickly finding out that half the population will always find fault with him, no matter what he does. And now the implication of that becomes very important. We saw yesterday that he had to sell another $3.8 billion of Tesla stock. Why is that? It's because this transaction, which was, very tight to get done, probably required lots of margin. I have a margin loan at Credit Suisse, so I know how these things work. And you can very quickly get margin called. You have to sell down things that you own in order to maintain your collateral limits. We've talked about this before. He's had to do this twice now in the last few weeks. And that's because, again, not because of the demand at Tesla, as far as we can tell, but because people believe he's distracted. And so people are anticipating weakness at Tesla. People are now shorting the stock. Anyways, it's causing this downward spiral. And can he fix it? I think so. Can he pull it all out? Sure. Is it just putting himself under an enormous amount of pressure that he could have avoided? Somewhat, yes. And I think that this is sort of where we're at.
6 weeks in.
My gosh.
Totally.
Yeah.
Well, I was saying this guy learned in 6 weeks what it took YouTube 7 years to learn, how hard it is to moderate content. And, I think
this is where I disagree is
Okay,
you're attributing so much good faith to these content moderators at YouTube and Twitter when the Twitter files reveal that they made no effort to suppress their bias. In fact, they were pretty much doing the equivalent. They were doing the equivalent of dancing in the streets every time they booted off someone they didn't like.
Fair enough. Before you react to what Freeberg just said at the end, that coda, can you respond to what I just said? Isn't it true?
Well, look, if you define what Elon is, doing there as, acting as a judge, arbitrating on every little content moderation decision, is that a great use of his time relative to what he could be building at Tesla and SpaceX and doing on behalf of humanity? Then no, clearly not. But if you define what he's doing in the larger sense as restoring free speech to the most important town square social network, hopefully thereby inspiring other tech companies to move in the direction of opening things up, then I actually think it's a pretty good use of his time. So look, I think we can quibble about this or that decision that he makes or this or that tweet, but I think the overall thrust of what he's doing is very important for the country and for humanity. So I get where you're coming from. Hopefully he'll find some people at Twitter who he can empower and trust to make these content moderation decisions so he's not drawn into every single little battle, right? We do want him focused on the highest priority problems.
My point is just that I get that. I just think that what he's learning and what we're living and seeing in real time is that there is no canonically right decision ever in this space. There's only a decision where some percentage will support and some percentage will always be against. That's my point.
Correct.
He did say when he took over, he knew that would be the case. He said, you will know I'm doing the good job when both sides are equally upset. Just to put a pin in it, I think it's important for people to understand what the new policy is. So I'm just going to quickly read it just to put a pin in
hang on. Sorry, hang on one sec before you get to, because I think the philosophical point rather than the specific one is an important one. And I just want to respond to what Chamath said and have Sachs respond to this. In the case of the points you make around the Twitter files, and by the way, I don't agree with any of the moderation decisions personally. So I don't think that someone should be suspended for posting public information. I don't think someone should be suspended for saying controversial things. That's my personal opinion, just so I'm clear on that. Because I know that,
you would describe yourself as strong free speech.
Yes.
Yeah, libertarian, strong free. Okay, got it.
Sure. And so in this particular case, I think what really irked me, I was trying to identify why it made me so angry what he did yesterday. Yeah. It triggered me. It really did. And I think the reason was that in the case of the Twitter file points, it was a minority. It was a minority that was affected. It was one person that was affected because the majority wanted to do that thing to that person. And I think in this case, it's that the minority wants to affect the majority in the sense that Elon has aggregated this control and this power over moderation. And he's benefiting himself and a few people that have private planes. And he's shutting down hundreds of Twitter feeds that are using publicly available information. And so it feels even more onerous of a use of power and influence because he's doing something that benefits a small number and affecting a larger number, whereas the other one was affecting a small number that benefited a large number, because that's what a lot of people wanted to see happen. A lot of people wanted to see Trump suspended, and it wasn't right either.
Okay.
I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, we understand your position completely. I just want to add to that. In this policy, I think it's very important to understand what he is saying about this. Accounts dedicated to sharing someone else's live location are going to be suspended going forward. You can still share your own location, obviously. Content required, content for public engagements, the president is speaking somewhere, whatever. You just really can't be persistently, consistently tracking an individual otherwise known in, plain
Jason,
speak as stalking.
But Jason, if NPR is live tweeting,
sure,
Jerome Powell's speech,
perfect, no problem,
at XYZ location,
not a problem. If they do Jerome Powell's location for the next year, for the next year, 10 times a week, on his off duty, on duty, that's the thing we're talking about.
I'm just saying, let's just say he gives a speech every week. Is that illegal?
No, if you're giving a speech at a public place where you've announced that you're going to be appearing at a certain time and place, you've already made public where you're going to be. What we're talking about is, and what Elon Jet was showing was a live stream of precision GPS coordinates over a sustained period of time.
Yes.
And not to be too dramatic about it, but if you look at the weapons that are so successfully being used in Ukraine right now, they're all precision GPS guided. Now, right now, you have to be a state actor to get a hold of those weapons, but you could imagine over the next decade that having someone's precise GPS coordinates over a sustained period of time, it would be pretty easy to target them for, and not to be dramatic here, but for assassination. That is a security risk. There's no way around that.
I brought this up with Palmer Luckey, man. I'm scared. That dude could come at me anytime when I get my jet. I don't want Palmer Luckey taking me out.
This is about a jet. But
Yo, Palmer, I'm sorry, dude. Do not take me out. I'm going to get my jet. I'll be on my first flight, and he's just going to send a drone in.
But look, let's talk about hypocrisy for a second, okay? Because
here we go.
Let's talk about CNN's hypocrisy and the media's hypocrisy. Because earlier in the week, they were saying that any criticism of Yoel Roth, who is Twitter's former head of trust and safety, amounted to a threat to his safety. And they had this theatrical tweet where they claimed he was having to flee his house, which a lot of people found pretty preposterous. They were basically saying that public criticism of someone who has put themselves out there to engage in a public debate, who's writing op-eds for the New York Times, that is a threat to safety. However, publishing someone's real-time location on a continuous basis so they can be targeted.
It's not intellectually consistent. It's not intellectually consistent.
It's not a threat to safety.
That is
I'm sorry.
Yeah,
if one of those two things is a threat to safety, it's the real-time doxing of somebody.
Yes.
I think we now understand why Elon did what he did. He basically had an incident in LA in which the safety of his kid was threatened because he's got stalkers coming after him. So his safety is a real issue. This is not a made-up issue.
But why should why should his personal experience affect the usage of the service that hundreds of millions of people use? And that's the big issue.
The decision should not be based on what affects him personally. There needs to be a principled basis. There needs to be a principled basis for any decision about content moderation or censorship. Maybe in the first few hours of that decision, it wasn't handled perfectly because there wasn't a principled basis. But since then, one has been put in place. The principal basis is what Jake House showed. And this applies to everybody. And so, now it's a debate about whether that policy makes sense. Now, is Elon just as arbitrary and capricious as the former executives who are running trust and safety at Twitter? I don't think so, for two reasons. Number one, he's promised transparency. He said that when we ban or shadow ban an account, there has to be a reason for it, and you have to be alerted to it. In other words, none of the shadow stuff.
No
shadow. You need to be informed.
You get your speeding ticket. You get your ticket. It's there, right? No more shadow.
That is different. And then the second thing is that, and again, I think you could say they didn't do this perfectly in the first few hours, but there needs to be a principled basis for a censorship decision, and it needs to be applied to everyone equally. And so far, we haven't seen any basis for believing that he's not applying this principle equally. I mean, it's still very early. Whereas the former rulers at Twitter were indulging their personal bias and personal preferences in who they were banning. There were two standards of justice. If you were someone who was allied with them, it was almost impossible to get censored, no matter how hateful your tweets were. But if you were somebody on the other side of the political debate, they were eager to suppress you. And I think that at least so far, Elon has not shown that type of selectivity.
He selected against someone that put him at personal risk.
I think, yes. And
but you understand what I'm saying? If that's where the decision had stayed, then I would agree with you. But I think that since then, they've put in place. They've undergirded that decision with
gotta
a
tell
principal
you,
policy.
I think those tweet streams are cool. I think there's some cool tweet streams that some of these people run, and there are hundreds of them, and they're actually kind of cool. You can see where these different
You're in
planes,
favor of people tracking people's
they
planes.
show like where Air Force One is. They show all these different planes. Look, and whether or not the FAA should be publishing this data is a separate question, but it's on the open internet. It is already there. It's like turning off the RSS feed from the open internet to protect himself.
Okay.
That's why it feels onerous.
So here's the part I agree with, which is I think this policy with regard to planes specifically is going to be futile.
Yeah.
It's going to be, at best, harm reduction, because as
Totally.
long as there's many ways to publish this information,
it's on Reddit,
it's pointless
it's
to
on
suppress it on Twitter.
Facebook.
So
Yeah,
listen, I think this whole policy on Twitter is a little bit of a red herring. I think the real issue, the real underlying issue, is that the FAA is publishing these ICAO numbers, thereby making every plane personally identifiable. I don't think I haven't
have a
heard
counter
anyone
to it,
explain
Sachs,
why
if I
that's
may.
necessary.
I have a counter to it, actually, Sachs, if I may. What we saw, whether you agree with it or not, with the mass banning of certain individuals, did actually silence them and take them out of the public square. One of the reasons, in fact, Elon wanted to buy Twitter. So if you look at certain individuals, whether it's Milo, Alex Jones, Trump himself, right on down the line, when they got banned across all systems, it was dramatic in terms of the reach of that information. So because of the size and scale of YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, etc., when they act in coordination, they can have a dramatic impact. Not a perfect impact, but a dramatic, which is why we have this issue of, hey, should 230 be rethought? Because when they act en masse, it is extraordinary what they can do to an individual. They took Alex Jones. How do you consume Alex Jones? You have to seek that out in a major way. It's distinctly different. Chamath, last word, and then we're moving on to what could be the greatest science corner ever in the history of All In Pod. Final word, Chamath.
I think this is a great transition. We're about to talk about nuclear fusion. And my point is, I don't care about any of this stuff. Like I said, this is my point is like if you take like an average person, okay, we are, let's say, awake 16 hours a day. And, if you take out the time with our family, David, the family is people that are related to you.
We'll get that. Can we DM Sachs those people one more time?
We'll send you their names. But if you take that out and you take out, exercising and, bathroom
Can we also
time
explain
and
that
eating.
to Sachs? That's when you increase your heart rate and sweat, Sachs.
The point is that you have, let's just call it 12 hours, of functional executive time that you can apply to a problem. And you can break that down into these blocks, right? I would really love what is basically the smartest human and the most productive human of our generation to be filling those blocks with things that sort of like really transcend and increasingly, and I agree that freedom of speech is important, increasingly those buckets are being filled with things that are very low level and hyper tactical and are distractions at best to the path of free speech. And so I think that hopefully he gets all this shit under control over there. He finds a good executive team. I would like to see him get back to landing rockets on barges, getting to Mars.
Let's do it.
Getting to the moon.
Finish self-driving. We're almost there.
Chamath definitely has a point. I'd just say one of the reasons why we don't care that much about this issue is because I think something to understand that's important is there are different kinds of speech, and different kinds of speech deserve different levels of protection. The fact of the matter is, like, business advertising is not as protected as political speech. Porn is not as protected as political speech. Political speech criticizing the people in power, is the most protected category of speech because the founders of the country understood that the people in power will always try to insulate themselves from accountability by limiting that kind of speech. But that is precisely the kind of speech that the former rulers of Twitter suppressed the most and showed the least sensitivity to. So listen, I mean, is Elon going to be the perfect content moderator? No. I mean,
nobody is.
Nobody is. But I do not believe that puts him in the same category as, Vijaya Gadde or Yoel Roth, who showed no sensitivity for political speech. He has indicated a desire to restore freedom of speech, and I think they ultimately ended up in a good place.
I want him to get us to Mars. I want him to get us to Mars. I don't care about.
Let's move on.